On today's episode of the Guitar Reliquary, I'm going to be doing my very first full evaluation and setup of a guitar. So my dad is a big Eddie Van Halen fan and wanted this stealth EVH guitar 5150 because he had the uh, slime green one, and he's a big fan of rock and metal, and he likes the satin black to go with it. And I get it; it's a beautiful looking guitar. But what I'm going to do today is actually give it a full setup for him, and I'm going to show you some of the things that I do to evaluate a guitar when I first receive it. So the first thing I tend to do is assess whether or not the frets are level. And to assess whether or not the frets are level, I just sight down the neck. So I'll take the guitar and I'll hold it in this manner and sight down the neck. And I'll do it on both sides. And when I do that, the frets on this are actually very good. I don't see any cause for concern. It's tough to evaluate the middle of the fretboard until I have the action and things set correctly. So that's what I'm going to work on first. So this beautiful guitar has Floyd Rose. It's actually easier to set up than most Floyd Rose guitars because the Floyd sits on the top of the body. There is no cutaway for the ability to whammy up. The bridge is slightly off the body right now. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to put that bridge down. So I'm going to get my appropriate wrench size over here. And it usually takes me a couple tries to figure out which Allen wrench I need, but I'm just going to make sure I have the right one that's snug. And I use wrenches from the Ernie Ball Music Man toolkit that I have had for probably a decade at this point, since it first came out. So you could see the first two that I chose didn't work. Let's check out the third. Yeah, the third, that's the right one. So when I do this, I want to be careful though, because with it sitting flush on top of the body, you don't want to over tighten these set screws, or else you risk actually stripping them out and ruining the knife edge on the trem. And some people believe you should relax the strings when you do this. I've gotten professionally set up guitars and I've never seen them do that. So I'm not really going to worry about it. I'm just going to give it a quick turn. That's perfect. And then on this side as well, to make sure that this side is correct, I'm going to give it a turn over here too. And then once I've done that, so this side really didn't need it. So now that I've done that, the bridge is correctly flush on the body. There is no really room for, well, actually I've got a little bit of wiggle room to go down on both sides even further. But because of the detuner, we want to make sure that it is, just on top of the top, so that we can actually use the detuner, because it can't be set to floating and have the detuner function properly. So we're just making sure that we're where we want to be. And I'm taking very small increments, as you can see, on turns, because I don't want to overdo it. Still got a little bit of up wiggle, so let's give it a little bit more. And that one's really resisting, so I'm getting close to the point where it shouldn't be adjusted down anymore without hurting the knife edge. And I think that's as good as we're going to be able to go. So that's perfect. We've set that low. Now what I'll do is get the relief in the neck correct so that I can evaluate whether or not the frets are level by having the correct straightness of the neck, and also whether or not this guitar is going to need a shim in order to get the action that is desired. And you're familiar with my action measurements from previous videos. I'm going to try to replicate that on this, but I find that My dad prefers to have the treble side a little bit higher than I do, and is okay with that action. So we'll just do the best we can to get it where it should be. So to evaluate what the neck relief looks like, I'm going to take a capo, and I've had this capo actually since my very first guitar. I have no idea who makes it. It has no branding on it. Oh, wait. It's actually a Shub capo. So I guess it does have branding on it. I've just never looked at it. And what I'm going to do is capo the first fret, and then take my relief gauge, and I have just a snap-on relief gauge here for 0.01, which is what the recommended relief is for most electric guitars. And I like it a little less than that. So what I'm looking for is this to actually cause the string to push up. And actually, I've got probably double the clearance here at the 9th fret. And so what I'm going to want to do is tighten that neck. Tighten that truss rod. And so to tighten the truss rod, I have a little tool here. This actually was, my dad made this, but it's the same thing that you can buy from Ernie Ball, which is a truss rod adjustment tool for the wheels at the end of the neck. And the way that the neck relief works on a butt adjust truss rod with a wheel is if I have too much relief, so I have this situation, which is what's going on here, then I want to actually tighten the truss rod. And to tighten the truss rod, I'm going to turn it towards the camera. And actually, I'm finding this isn't going to fit, so I'm going to need to use a slightly smaller Allen wrench to do this. And so I just grabbed a smaller Allen wrench, and I'm going to give it about a quarter turn. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and do the same thing I did before to evaluate the relief. So I'm still above 0.01 here at the 9th fret. So I'm going to give it another quarter turn, because remember, my goal is to get it actually below 0.01. So I gave it a little bit, give it a little bit more. By the way, these are a great invention, these butt adjust truss rod things, because then you don't have to take a truss rod cover off or take a neck off, which is the case with some of the vintage Fenders. So I've done that now, and I'm right at about 0.01. So I'm going to give it just a little bit more of a tweak to get it to where I think it should be. All right, and this might have a two-way truss rod, so I might be passing through a center point at this point. Okay, so I'm right at 0.01 now. Give it just a little bit more. Yeah, I'm passing through a center point here. I've got no resistance. So, oh, there we go. Now it's starting to tighten. So that's going to be probably perfect for what we want. Yeah, it is. It's perfect. So now I've set the relief perfectly in the neck. So I can take my capo off, my first fret, and I can just do a quick set of bends with the action the way it is. The action's a little high in my opinion, but I'll just do a quick set of bends with the action the way it is and see if any of them are buzzing out or fretting out. Great, none of them are doing that. So let's take a measurement though to see what the actual measurements of the action are at the 12th fret. Because remember, my goal is to get this down to something like close to 4/64ths on this end of the fretboard, and something like 3/64ths, maybe 3.5, depending on if the fretwork allows it on the treble side. So I've just got my engineering rule, and I use the same engineering rule for all of my setup work so that I can replicate it on different guitars. And what I'm finding right here is that I'm closer to 5/64ths on the bass side, and I'm probably like 4.5/64ths on the treble side. So there's a good chance that I'm going to have to shim this neck to get the action that we want. But the first thing I'm going to do is evaluate down at the other end. Now, my dad requested to have 10 to 52 gauge strings put on this. It's currently got 9s. What I find is that a lot of companies leave the action high at the nut with 9s because they're worried about buzz. And so I'll just measure this. And yeah, it's a bit high at the nut. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to take the shim that's underneath the nut off and then check this again. And see if that will allow us to have a little bit of a lower action in the middle of the neck, because when you bring down the nut, it should adjust it a little. It might get it to 4 and 4, and if it gets it to 4 and 4, I might not shim the neck. We'll see how it looks. Okay, so I need to remove my my lock nuts here on the neck. So what I'm going to do is find that appropriate sized wrench again, which I had from earlier, and just loosen those up. And then I'll take them off the rest of the way by hand. And I like to keep them in sequence so that when you put them back on, you have the bass ones on the bass strings and the treble one on the treble strings, so that, you know, if they've made an impression already from the factory, you just keep that same thing going on. So what I'm going to do now is loosen the strings so that I can take the nut off. And I'm actually not going to take the strings off yet. I'm just going to take relax them so I can get the nut off. Great. So the way that the nut is attached here is through 2 bolts on the back. So I'm going to have to release those bolts to get the nut off. So I'm going to take, again, the appropriate size wrench for that. I'm going to probably take the whammy bar off here. I don't need the trem arm on while I'm doing this. So I've got that. And just get the right wrench. Perfect. And I'll just get them out far enough to actually take them out by hand. All right, perfect. So now get those screws that go through the neck. Try not to lose little washers on them. And I can take the nut off. Okay, so I got the nut off, and they've got quite a shim underneath that. I'm first going to try it without a shim to see what the action looks like, and then decide if I need to use an appropriate shim. And I have all kinds of shims that I procured from StewMac for very cheap, and I put them somewhere here. I'll show you what they look like when I find them again. It's my sloppiness paying off. Okay, so I've taken that off. I'm just going to put the nut back on now with no shim and see how that works. Setup sometimes to get it exactly how you want it is a trial and error process, and you're going to have to do things a few times to, you know, get what you want out of your guitar. Okay. So I've done that. I'm going to put the screws back into it. And I'm holding the nut with my left hand while I do this with my right hand so that I can make sure that the screw holes line up. And I'll just tighten that back down. Okay, beautiful. Beautiful. So I've put the nut back on. Now I'm just going to tighten my strings up enough that they have tension on them so that I can determine whether or not it's going to be necessary to shim this. If you really want to get a good sense of what that action is at the first fret, I use an engineering rule, as you just saw me do, but you can also use feeler gauges, and I was fortunate enough that my dad gave me a Fender Custom Shop set of radius gauges as part of the Fender Custom Shop toolkit. And I can actually just slide these in underneath the first string at the first fret and the sixth string at the first fret and see what they're looking like. So generally for me, with a set of 10s or 11s, I want a 0.024 for the bass and a 0.01 or so for the treble. So I'm just going to slide this 0.022 in there, and I'll have to look at it this way, unfortunately, because I need to see if it's raising the string at all. And it's not 0.022, it's a little lower. So it's not 0.02 either. Let's check about 0.018. And actually 0.018, I measured my Steve Morse guitar that I did the video on, and that's what the nut is on the low E for that. It's really close. So I think we're pretty close to 0.018. And again, this is with the 9s. When we put the 10 to 52s on, we're going to have more tension on the neck, and we're going to have less likelihood of fret buzz at that first fret. So I think that's going to be good. And then we could just check the other side with my radius gauge, with my other feeler gauge. Ooh, and it's actually a little below 0.01. So let's just do the old third fret test where we tap and see if there's clearance. Ooh, just a little bit. But I don't hear any pinging or anything, so I think it's going to be okay. So great, that was easy. Okay, so now I've got my nut height set properly. I just took that shim off that was underneath it. By the way, I love it when they come shimmed from the factory. I've set my bridge height so that that's correct. And now what I'm going to do is check my action at the 12th fret again and determine whether or not I need to do a shim. So my action is perfect on the bass side, and it's, pretty much perfect on the treble side. It's 4/64 of an inch. If I'd had to shim the neck, and that would still be an option if you wanted a floating trem, you could just raise the trem up a little bit and then shim the neck, and then your action would work out. But if I had to, I would just remove these 4 screws after I'd taken the strings off, and then I would take one of these tapered nut shims that you can buy online to put into the pocket. And I actually am a firm believer that you should have a whole pocket nut shim, because it will prevent air gaps from being in there and eventually warping your fretboard. And we don't want that, especially on a shredder's guitar like a Van Halen. So these come in various degree increments. This is a 1 degree carbon fiber shim. It is way thicker than we would need for this guitar. At most, we'd need a 0.25 degree shim. But it's great. It's black. It would match with the guitar, and we wouldn't even know that there was a shim in there unless we really looked for it. So that's something that you could do if you needed to do it. I don't in this case. This will be just fine as is. Okay, great. So now the next step would be to actually get the strings off of this and get it ready for the 10 to 52 gauge before I change the intonation at the bridge. And I will show you how I do the intonation in a moment. Okay, so right now I'm just going to take my strings all the way off, and at the same time, my dad requested that I put this red chrome detuna on it because he thought that that would look better. So that's what I'm going to do. So again, I'll just take my string winder. I'll remove all of the strings from the guitar, and all I do is loosen them. And then I'm just going to cut them off with a pair of wire clippers. So now I can just take the strings And remember, I'll need the appropriate wrench here to release the strings at the back of the Floyd. And I just loosen them enough to get the strings out. I don't want to loosen them too much because I don't want the little blocks inside of the saddles to fall out. Beautiful. And what just happened there is the Floyd moved up on the saddle post because there was no string tension pulling it forward. That's no problem. I can just slide it back in and take a rag or something that I bunch up and slide under it, and then it will stay right on those posts. Beautiful. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is take the D-tuna off. So I'm just taking this, releasing the set screw as much as I can, and then screwing the saddle all the way out to remove the D-tuna. Okay, so I've got the original D-tuna that came on it out. So now I'm going to put the next D-tuna on, which is the red one. All right, so got that nice little red chrome. And I'm going to just double check the set screw length against the ones that came with it to make sure I use the same one. So I need that one. This one is longer, so I don't need the longer one. So I'll put the longer one back. And I like to put things away as I go because I'm worried that I will do something stupid and lose a piece of something that I need. So now I've got the D-tuna. I've got the spring that came with it. I'm just going to stick the spring inside of it. And then it's all good to go there. And I will now screw this back in. And I'll probably need the bar to get this aligned properly. Okay. So I got that in there. That's good. Awesome. And then, yeah, that D-tuna will engage. And we'll have to set up the D-tuna later. But for now, it's good. Okay. All right. Beautiful. So now I got the new D-tuna on. That was no problem. I'm going to do a couple things at this point. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually tighten the truss rod a couple more turns because I am putting heavier gauge strings on the guitar, and I know that that is going to impact the neck relief, and I like to just sort of back bow it so that it comes into a closer spot once the heavy gauge strings are put on it. Another thing that I could do if I wanted to at this point is polish the frets. The frets actually look pretty good here. I don't know that they need a polishing, but if I were to polish them, I would use something like the Frine polish from Music Nomad, and I would just tape the board off with some painter's tape. But it looks good. These are very nice, highly polished frets already. I don't think I'm going to have any benefit from polishing them any further. So the other thing I'm going to do is now flip over the back, and I'm going to take the back plate off so that I can add a couple springs to the bridge to account for the bigger strings. So I just have a eyeglasses screwdriver that works very well for guitar stuff too. I think I actually got this as a Radio Shack. I don't know anymore because all of the markings have pretty much worn off. But this is the screwdriver I've had for probably a decade. right, so now I've got the back plate loosened. Just take it off. And as expected, there are only 2 springs on this because of the 9s. I'm going to need 3 springs, possibly 4 springs to make this work with the heavier gauge strings. So I made sure that I got some extra tremolo springs, and I'm just going to start with 1 and then start stringing it up. Okay, so I got my spring, and I'll just put it into the trem first and then stretch the spring out to the claw, and boom, I've got my 3rd spring on there. You know, just be careful when doing this because these are under a pretty good tension and it does take a bit of strength to do it, and it's a good way to hurt your fingers. Sometimes I will wear cloth gloves when I do it or something like that to just protect my fingers, especially since I'm going to want to play later today. All right, so now I've got my 3rd thing on. I'm going to start by stringing this up at the middle of the board. So I always start with the D and G strings to put the tension on the center of the neck. I don't actually know if that will prevent the neck from warping, but it's something I do anyways. So these are the strings that I'm going to be putting on this Van Halen, the Diodario XS strings. I love these strings. For coated strings, they're probably the best I've ever played. And plus you get the nice Player's Circle code that you can enter on the Diodario website. And once you get enough points, you can get strap locks or tuners or, you know, strings for free, basically, from your rewards points. So I love that. So these are a little different than other Diodario strings. The XS have only black, brass, and silver ball ends as opposed to the multicolored ones that you're probably familiar with a set of regular XLs. So I do actually keep this handy because I have not memorized them yet. But it looks like the D is going to be wound with a silver ball at the end. So I'm just going to locate that D string and get started stringing this up. Okay, so now that I've got it restrung to some extent, I'm going to readjust the string tree. So with the string tree, you want to make sure that it's low enough that the strings are in contact with the back of the nut when it's tuned up. And that's a critical first step to do before you go ahead and adjust the intonation and the tuning and balance the Floyd and all that stuff that you have to do with a guitar like this. All right, so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to start by balancing the Floyd. So I'm going to get a tuner, and I just use a headstock tuner for this part. Because I'm not at the intonation step yet. And I want to make sure that the D-tuner is in, because when the D-tuner is in, that is supposed to be standard, and that will be important when we make sure that the D-tuner actually works later on. And the D-tuner is not contacting the top of the guitar, in case you were concerned about that. So I take my whammy bar out of here, and I'm ready to start tuning. We're not hearing any strings choking at the first position. So remember, I pre-tightened my truss rod, and that's good because right now I'm pretty good in neck relief. I don't really need to worry too much about neck relief. So I'm just going to stretch my strings because that's an important step as well in setting these up, and especially in intonation. You need to have well-stretched new strings to intonate a guitar properly. So I'll generally do the strings this way, but then I'm also going to do some big bends with them. So the neck has started to move a little bit, so I'm going to just tighten that up a little bit more. And then to maintain the tension I want. And then I'm going to tighten back the claw a little bit because this is floating a little too much when we do bends. So we don't want it quite as floaty with bends. So I just take my Ernie ball screwdriver. Again, I've had this forever and it's worn off. Everything's got some electrical tape and damage to it, but it's a good screwdriver. All right, so just gave it a little bit of a turn. That should be enough to keep it from moving too much when I'm bending and make sure that I can get a good setup. Ooh, and it feels really great to play now. So we've definitely got the setup dialed in to where we want it. And I'll just give it a final measurement with these new strings on it to see what we're at for action height. Yeah, we're right at 4 on the bass side and a little under 4 on the treble side. So we're perfect with the action. We don't probably want to go much lower. No fret out, so that indicates that the fretwork is still good for the action that we've chosen. If I had come across a high fret, I would have used my spot leveler, my diamond spot leveler from StewMac. And if there were several frets that needed to be addressed, I would just tape off the board and do a fret level. But that's not necessary at this point. So now we've got the guitar set up. We've got the new D-Tuna installed. We've got pretty much everything ready to go except our intonation. So I'm going to switch us over to a slightly different position so you can see the intonation process a little bit better. Okay, so now I'm going to start intonating. So I always check intonation in the playing position and then adjust afterwards. So I use a Peterson Strobo Plus HD for my tuner for this process, and I use the 12th fret flageolet method with the neck pickup and the tone rolled off. So I'm in playing position. I'm going to make sure I tune to the appropriate note for the low E. And actually my neck is moved a little bit more, so I'm going to just tighten this up. So it's very important that your neck relief be appropriate when you're doing your intonation, because otherwise the pressure you use to fret the note will be off and you'll wind up with generally a sharper note. So I'm just checking with a strobe tuner. I want to make sure that the note stops. So hopefully we'll be able to see the tuner and me. So my note is quite sharp, so that means I'm going to have to move the saddle back. Now, if this did not have the D-Tuna, I would use my special intonation tool for Floyd Rose's. It's called the Key. You can buy it on StewMac. You can also buy off-brand ones elsewhere, and it's just a really phenomenal tool to help you set up a Floyd Rose guitar. So what I'll do is I'll relax my low E string so that I have room to move the saddle back. And then I'll take and release this screw, which is the saddle set screw. And generally these are on very tight because you don't want them slipping. So I've released that. And I actually need to go back far enough to the next hole because I'm not going to have enough room of travel. So I'm just going to make sure that I pull that out and seat it in the next hole in the base plate of the Floyd. And it's important I don't force this screw because I don't want to strip it out. That would be incredibly bad. So it's going in nice and smooth. And then I will give it a snug. And again, I'll make sure my D-tuna is pushed in because that's the standard tuning. And right now I'm not going to worry about the D-tuna's functionality so much as I am just getting the intonation right in standard tuning. And then I can go back and set up the D-tuna later. I'll actually need to review the literature for that because it's been a long time since I did a D-tuna. So it's very important I get that strobe to stop or get as close to stopping as I can. Right there's pretty good. And then I'm pretty stopped. So I've set the intonation for the low E with that adjustment. It rarely works that you just make one adjustment. You usually have to make several. So now I'll go on to the A string. And with the A string, I'm actually going to be able to use my key tool, and I'll show you how to do that. So I start by relaxing the A string, and then I'm going to put the key tool on, and the key is going to set between the screw and the bridge plate. There we go. And I'm just going to tighten it till it's snug. Beautiful. Now when I release this saddle, I can adjust it back using either tightening or loosening of this screw. All right, so made a slight adjustment back because with bigger strings coming from 9s, I expect that we'll probably have to lengthen it. So if you're not familiar with intonation, if you have a string that is sharp when fretted, you pull the saddle away from the nut. And if you have a string that is flat when fretted, you move the saddle towards the nut. So I did my little adjustment, and now I'll take my key off and check my intonation. I like to give it some good bends to make sure that I'm really testing the string at its right spot. Sometimes the tuner gets a little wonky with overtones. Oh, that's pretty well perfect. It might need to go forward just a hair. Oh no, it's good. I'm not gonna muck with it. So now we'll move on to the D string. We'll turn this a little bit more just in case the camera can pick it up. So the D string's a little sharp. So I actually don't know if I'm even going to do anything with that. Yeah, I'll move it back just a hair. It's not much though. It's like a little small adjustment. I'm very particular about my intonation. My ears are sensitive to dissonance that's introduced by, notes bleeding slightly out of tune. So I like to make sure that I'm as close to in tune as I can be with the intonation. And the great thing about the intonation is once it's set on a Floyd, as long as you use the same string gauge, you really shouldn't have to adjust the saddles really ever again unless one of them slips. And I like that because it's very time intensive, as you can see. So I've gone and I've put my key on. I'm going to relax this, maybe. And I'm going to tighten it up just a hair. And then we're going to tune it back up. and check that intonation. So notice I don't bother pulling the screws all the way out for this process, just loosen them enough to move the saddle. So this is a bit sharp, so it should come back. It's no surprise you often see the G string closer to the E string saddle when you do intonation. I completed the setup on this guitar. The only thing that I had to do was just adjust the D tuner after I'd installed it, which was a very straightforward process. I just tuned it to D with the set screw all the way up, and then adjusted the set screw on the side of the D tuner until it went to E when I put it in, and now it is working correctly. So I hope you've enjoyed this setup video, and I hope you'll join me for my review and demo of this in the next. Have a nice day.